But first, to the major news today that the Albanese government has set an emissions reduction target of 62 to 70% by 2035. That's in just 10 years' time. Right now, Australia is technically, theoretically, at 27%. But this figure is inflated and it's actually closer to 3%. I'll explain why in a moment. But first, here's Albanese and Chris Bowen today arguing their case for an emissions reduction target of 62 to 70%.
This is a responsible target, backed by the science, backed by a practical plan to get there and built on proven technology. It's the right target to protect our environment, to protect and advance our economy and jobs, and to ensure that we act in our national interest.
Our target setting process is the best, most rigorous in the world, set out by the Climate Change Act that this government put into place. It makes clear what the Climate Change Authority must consider and makes clear what I must consider in considering their advice.
The coalition immediately launched its attack, arguing the target is too high and will not be met. Opposition leader Susan Lee even described it as a fantasy.
We are dead against Labor's 2035 interim emission reduction targets.
Do you think net zero by 2050 is also woefully impossible?
Our energy policy is going through a detailed policy development process. That's our energy policy more broadly. Targets must be achievable and realistic, and these are not.
And Susan Lee made it clear that the coalition party room was unanimously opposed to these targets that can't possibly be met and that might destroy Australia in the process. And this is where the debate will be, not whether or not emissions should be reduced. Susan Lee said today that reducing emissions is important. Both sides agree on that. The debate will be around the cost of the government's targets. And there needs to be an honest discussion. But the Albanese government is not being honest. The Prime Minister refuses to reveal the cost to taxpayers of this highly ambitious target. And he still claimed that electricity prices would fall. And he was laughing about the fact that his promise of $275 power bill reduction never came to pass.
Minister, you say this will put downward pressure on energy prices. By what exact figure?
You yourself laughed when you asked that question, so it should be treated in the spirit in which you've done.
Well, that's not good enough. Many Australians, naively, in my view, but many Australians voted for Albanese because they wanted cheaper bills and more affordable cost of living. And he's never apologised for the broken promise that he made some 99 times. So I'm not sure why he's laughing about it. So the political debate will now centre on the cost that trying to meet these targets will have on business, industry, farmers and families. Now, even the government-friendly Productivity Commission is demanding that the government release publicly the costs of its targets. The Productivity Commission report on the net zero transformation, dated August 2025, recommends the government introduce a way to calculate costs. It's calling it TCCV. And it says, and I read this in the report today, and it says, and I quote, estimates of the implied carbon prices needed to meet emissions targets and are determined using information about potential opportunities to reduce emissions in the economy. And the Productivity Commission report states that while cost estimates are uncertain and they can change, they argue it's better for the government to provide the cost than not to do it at all. Here's what they say. The estimates should also be updated every few years as more information comes to hand about likely future emission reduction costs and as new interim targets are accounted. Again, this is the government-friendly Productivity Commission. It is saying the cost needs to be transparent. And they even provide a graph of the future costs of reducing emissions. And it's a horrifying picture. In the low estimate scenario, it'd cost $150 per tonne in 10 years' time. In the high estimate scenario, it'd cost $300 per tonne of CO2 in 10 years' time. Now, to put that into perspective, Julia Gillard's carbon tax was just $23 a tonne for Australia's 500 heaviest polluters. Now, the government can't seriously get away with pretending that these ambitious targets can be met without substantial cost. Now, the bulk of our emissions come from four main areas: electricity, vehicles, industry, and agriculture. To achieve the targets the government announced today that they're aiming for, it would require massive upheaval in each of those industries. There'd likely be carbon taxes sector by sector. There'd be much larger subsidies for renewables, and the cost of this would ultimately be borne by taxpayers. For industry, the government would have to raise the safeguard mechanism and bring in small businesses as well. This would effectively be an industry-wide carbon tax. The vehicle emission standard, which is essentially a tax on larger vehicles, would need to be increased and extended into heavy vehicles. Then in agriculture, there could be an agricultural emissions reporting scheme. Now, this is a little-known fact. Banks already will be forced to report the emissions of their customers, which includes farmers. This is already happening. It's been legislated, but it's barely reported in the news at all. I'm going to speak to Matt Canavan about it in a moment. So that is the cost. Well, now let's look at the question of whether it's even possible to meet the targets Chris Bowen announced today. The Department of Climate Change, Energy, Environment and Water's website, you can see it there, it states that emissions are currently down by 27% since 2005. You can see the figure there, down by 27% since 2005. That's how much the Department of Climate Change say we have reduced emissions in Australia over the past 20 years, 27%. Now, that data analyses emissions from electricity, agriculture, industry, a variety of different sectors. But, and if you're only half watching the television, I suggest you concentrate now because this is important and fascinating. The data is skewed because of one sector. It's called land use change and forestry. Now, the left-wing Australia Institute, it's a think tank, it explains it like this. It says when Australia was negotiating the terms of the Kyoto Protocol, the precursor to the Paris Agreement, it lobbied successfully for the inclusion of what became known as the Australia Clause, which allowed countries to include land use change and forestry emissions in their accounting. In very basic terms, it's related to the reduction in land clearing, forest management and planting trees. Now, the Australia Institute continues. Taking a graph of Australia's emissions over time, it is clear that Australia is not on the path to meeting its emissions targets. However, counting, and this is the acronym for the land use, accounting LULUCF emissions can lead to the mistaken impression that the country is on track with emissions reduction. Successive Australian governments have been cooking the books on climate for decades, thanks to LULUCF. Cooking the books, that's a left-wing think tank. Now, if you remove this land use sector, our emissions have only fallen by 2.8% since 2005. Again, this graph is from the Climate Change Department website. If you remove land use, you can see there our emissions have just fallen by 2.8%, not 27%. And in some sectors, emissions are actually rising. Now, that was a left-wing think tank that I quoted from. Well, now the Institute of Public Affairs is a conservative think tank, and it agrees. Its chief economist, Adam Crichton, who was on this show last night, he told me today that for all the economic damage, Australia isn't even close to achieving its emissions reduction target in real terms. It's only through creative accounting and land use with land use and trees that the government can claim they have fallen 27% since 2005. The reality is, when you look at the volume of emissions actually going into the atmosphere, they have declined only about 3%, well short of the 43% reduction the government has promised by 2030 on the government's own figures. And Adam says some sectors actually have higher emissions now than in 2005, including the transport sector, where they have risen 22%. So for all the billions of dollars the government has poured into this sector, and for all of our higher electricity bills, emissions have only fallen by 2.8% in the past 20 years. Shadow Finance Minister James Paterson also pointed out today that emissions have flatlined under Labor.
The Albanese government has failed to reduce emissions at all. They've flatlined. Unlike the previous governments, both the Abbott, Turnbull and Morrison governments all reduced emissions. This government has not reduced emissions and now expects us to believe that it will meet its 2030 target and then some by 2035 with a big increase in that target. I'm deeply sceptical about this government's ability to do so.
So ever since the Albanese government came to office, emissions have not fallen. But as James just said, they actually did fall under the coalition. Now, you think of how Labor weaponised climate change against Scott Morrison after the bushfires, when he went to Hawaii, and yet he as Prime Minister did reduce emissions significantly more than Albanese as Prime Minister has. Now, this is not the narrative the media likes to portray, of course, but you can't choose the facts. These are the facts. Now, even if you accept the 27% figure, the fact is the Albanese government hasn't lowered emissions at all since it came to office nearly 3.5 years ago. So with no action in 3.5 years, it suddenly expects emissions to fall by 16% to reach its 43% target by 2030 in less than 5 years' time. That alone is impossible. And then expecting it to fall by another 20% to reach its 62 to 70% target by 2035 is truly not just impossible, it is fanciful. Even Climate Change Authority Chair Matt Keane admitted today, in his words, that the target is ambitious.
The targets that we've recommended are ambitious. It is ambitious. It's up there with the highest level of ambition in the world.
It's an understatement. The bottom line is, for all of the pain to regular families through higher power bills, for all of the billions of dollars in government subsidies for renewable energy, emissions in the major sectors have only fallen by 2.8% since 2005. And there is no possible way, without extreme cost to the taxpayer and obscene upheaval, that the government could possibly meet the 2030 and 2035 targets. Now, again, both sides of politics agree emissions need to be reduced and renewables embraced. Even Matt Canavan, who, as I said, is up in a moment, he agrees that. But the question is, how much money should taxpayers personally pay to reduce emissions in Australia when our emissions comprise around 1% of global emissions? And IPA research shows that every fortnight, China emits the equivalent of Australia's annual emissions. The Albanese government needs to be honest about how much these world-leading ambitious targets will cost struggling families and how much of an impact this will actually have on global emissions.